Yes, we are now recording the Smitty Story Hour featuring Jorie Favreau. See, I did it again. The Smitty Story Hour series is brought to you by the Possums College Alumni Association. Again, if you have questions, be sure to drop them in the chat feature or in the Q&A, and we will get to them at the end. I do want to say Jim in Washington State tells us, yes, they have spring there. You can add your name and class year into the chat so everybody can see where you're from. And Jay is with Amy. We've got two Smitties in Vermont joining us. And they'll be on campus in just about a month, watching their dear son graduate. I love those legacy stories. Love them. Stephen Frederick from West Shazy. Let's see how we doing. David Bly, we knew you were here. Class of 81, that always shocks me. I always think it's 90 something. Why do I think I went to school with you? All right, Jorie, whenever you're ready, okay. I think we're good to go.
All right. Hello, everybody. I wish I could see you. I'm so used to seeing students when I teach them. It's very strange for me to not be able to see you. If you have any questions, feel free to even type them as I'm talking. And if it's something on that slide, Heather, just interrupt me and we'll address the question while we're on that slide. So as you might know, I'm telling a story in 3 parts today about surviving the Adirondacks. And when I put this together, it was cold and snowy outside, and I was thinking from that perspective. But it's spring here today. My daffodils are poking up, etc. So a little different view than when I first put this together. So I'll start with the story of the snowshoe hares. It is a wonderful study species. It is not territorial. It is not social. They provide very little parental care, and they're present and active in winter. And so what this means is they're fairly uncomplicated, and they're here and doing stuff when students are here working all winter. They don't leave, they don't migrate, they don't hibernate. So they're here and they're available. Plus there's lots of snowshoe hares here. Their ecology is fairly simple. It is everything wants to eat them. So there's mammalian predators, a variety of those, as well as a variety of avian predators. So they spend their life trying to avoid being eaten, but also trying to find enough food to eat. And again, the story is pretty simple. During the summer, they're eating herbaceous vegetation. In the winter, they're eating twig tips and bark. It doesn't seem particularly good sustenance to survive a winter. So I think that's part of where the question comes from, is how do they survive these winters? Also, they've been a wonderful study species because my colleague, Celia Evans, has done quite a bit of work from the plant's perspective on what snowshoe hares are eating. And so she and her students provided browse for snowshoe hares, and then monitored to see what they actually ate. And they found that basically snowshoe hares eat what's available. They're not terribly picky, but at the same time, they do have some preferred foods. Again, this is the work of Dr. Evans and her students looking at some preferred foods. So she was able to tell me something about what snowshoe hares eat here in the Adirondacks as I started my work. And the question that we were really thinking about from the beginning here was, how do they survive the winter here? As I said, it's pretty tough to survive winters. And so how do animals do this? Well, snowshoe hares, again, don't do things. So it made the story, we thought, more intriguing. They don't migrate. They don't leave for the winter. They're here. They don't store their energy in their bodies. Think about raccoons, how round they get before winter hits. Snowshoe hares, they have to be able to run away and avoid predators. So they can't put on that extra weight. They have to stay agile and be able to run away. They don't store food in other places like tree cavities either. And they don't hibernate. And they don't avoid the cold that much in that they don't have burrows, and they don't use that subnivean space, that space beneath the snow. They're on top of that snow. One thing they do is, of course, they change the color of their coat, but not just are they changing the color, but it has a better R value. Literally, the winter coat has a better insulative value than the summer coat. That does help. It's a little denser, it's a little longer, a little better insulation. So we started by saying, okay, what do we know about survivorship? We know from the literature they rarely live more than a couple years, but let's see what's happening here in the Adirondacks. And so this is work with one of my students, Connor Sincata. I was hoping some of my students will be on today. If you're here, definitely shout out. I want to know you're here. So Connor and I went up to a snowshoe hare derby in the northern Adirondacks, and we asked the folks if we could check out all the snowshoe hares as they came in to be weighed and recorded for the derby. And so we got our hand on hundreds of snowshoe hares, and we were able to age them and sex them and say some other, gather some other biological data. So from the data here, Connor has constructed a snapshot of how old snowshoe hares tend to be. So again, we found what we pretty much expected. So that's good. We've got some baseline data here. That's good stuff to have. Another student, Jessie Gardner, spent a lot of time radio tracking the snowshoe hares. She was out there in every season, winter, summer, spring, and fall, and she was radio tracking them. So she was able to tell us something about home range sizes. And she also did a great job of showing us home ranges placed on the landscape. And so each of these colored dots represent locations for a particular snowshoe hare. So the yellow dots are all one hare. And then the yellow polygon around that shows where that snowshoe hare was. So here's data on several different snowshoes. And one thing that she noticed is that they actually shifted their home ranges from summer to winter. And she didn't find evidence of this in the literature, where snowshoe hares spend the summer somewhere and then move someplace else for the winter and then move back the following summer. And she documented that with our snowshoes, and she presented that at the Adirondack Research Consortium. We also backtracked the snowshoe hares. This is really fun to do, of course. And we did this, Celia Evans did it with her general ecology class, and I did it with my animal behavior class. And you can go out and measure things like the distance between tracks, and that'll tell us how fast the snowshoe hares are moving. We can say something about the activity of the hares. What are they doing from the tracks, right? Are they traveling? Are they resting? Are they browsing? We can take measurements such as the snow depth and lots of measurements on the surrounding vegetation, like canopy cover. And, you know, one of the keys that we found to survival here is pretty straightforward, but it's good to have, again, this baseline knowledge. We found that the snowshoe hares in the winter are basically going to hunker down under canopy cover for protection, and they're going to move quickly through open areas and just move in order to find food. And seasonally, that they shift their home ranges to more optimal habitat in different seasons. So we're starting to get a feel for how do they survive winters up here. And this piece for me really helped me understand. This was something that I talked to my students about, and I explained this concept. Here's the thermoneutral zone right here. This is where an animal's body temperature goes from colder to warmer. It's exposed to colder to warmer temperatures. When it gets to right here where my cursor is here, this lower critical temperature, this is where animals start shivering, and they have to shiver in order to increase their body heat, right? So we had talked about this in class, and one of my students, John Nettermeyer, came to me and said, you know, I think for snowshoe hares to survive, when they reach their lower critical temperature, they're going to have to increase their activity, because in order to have more calories, they're going to have to move more to find food. Remember, they're not storing food in a central location. They're not storing food on their bodies. So they're going to have to move to find the food. We knew from the literature that the snowshoe hare's lower critical temperature was -10°C. And so he predicted that when snowshoe hares got to -10°C, when the temperature outside was to -10, that they would start moving more. And he said, can I test this? And I said, yeah, let's do it, right? And so it was really cool. We got some collars for snowshoe hares, radio collars, and we wanted radio collars that reflected activity. So the animals are moving more. The beep that we received was faster. And when they were moving slower, the beep was slower. So he could tell by listening if they were moving faster or slower and what they were doing. And the students put the collar on one of their pet rabbits and then watch the rabbit so they could actually see, correspond the movement of the rabbit to what they were hearing. And then we put them on wild snowshoe hares. And John waited for those cold nights. He went out in not so cold nights also, but in the middle of the winter at 1 o'clock in the morning, he was out radio tracking snowshoe hares, hoping that it'd be below -10°C. And if that's not a Smitty, I don't know what is. So he went out and collected this great data and then plotted the data. And so here's the data from the 3 snowshoe hares that we had enough data on, because they do get eaten during the winter and otherwise go off the air. And when you look at this, you will notice the -10° is marked here with this dashed line. So his prediction was when it got here that they should increase in activity. Now, it doesn't mean they can't be active over here. This could be where an owl was chasing them, and they were definitely very active. So some higher activities here don't preclude his conclusions here. And he fit a regression line. And for my data nerds like me out there, there's the actual data beneath that on the statistical test, that he found it to be statistically significant that indeed when snowshoe hares hit -10, and he didn't put that dashed line there just by looking at it. That's actually the results from the test, saying at -10 degrees, and it was -10.4 degrees, that the snowshoe hares actually started moving more. So another fantastic piece of work done by Paul Smith students. So just to kind of summarize that story relatively quickly there, we thought about this in a bunch of different ways. How do snowshoe hares survive? Things like avoiding predation, looking at their tracks and how the tracks varied compared to vegetation. We looked at what they were eating and the value of the food. We looked at thermoregulation. And basically it comes down to, for the snowshoe hares, outside of having that warm fur coat, outside of that it's a lot about habitat choice. It's about habitat choice and engaging in the behaviors that are needed to survive. So that's the first of the trilogy, the first of the 3 stories. Heather, if there's anybody has any questions about the snowshoe hares at this point, I'd be happy to answer any questions if anybody's typed anything in.
I haven't seen any questions come through yet, Jorie.
Okay. All right, so I'm going to, right before I leave this story, is just thank lots of folks who helped make this work happen. I didn't mention nearly all the students who participated. I see Steve Pop there in the center carrying a whole lot of snowshoe hare traps so that we could catch the snowshoe hares. These are live traps. So they hop in there, the door shuts behind them, and then we were able to measure them, put radio collars on them and whatnot. Caitlin DeGrave, there's a picture on the far left. That's when we were up at the snowshoe hare derby. So those are dead snowshoe hares, to make that clear. We're not mistreating some snowshoe hares in that picture. So thanks to the snowshoe hare derby folks for letting us bomb their event and show up and collect lots of data and sharing their spaghetti with us. Dewey here in Saranac Lake allowed us to trap and radio track on their property. The Vic also did the same. And there's other students here present, Jake Dillon and other students that helped with all this work. So it's just been a really fun adventure with the students working on this question. From here, I'm going to move on to the next one. And again, it's about surviving. So the next picture is more dead animals. And I guess sometimes I take this for granted. I see a lot of dead animals and I don't think twice about it, but I forget sometimes other people may not want to see it right away. So there's more dead animals in the next picture. These are songbirds. These are not birds from Paul Smith's, but I had seen quite a few pictures like these. The background on this is birds tend to migrate at night, and the lights reflecting off of buildings can be confusing for them. Or even during the day, the windows can reflect sky, they can reflect trees, and the windows may look to the birds as if they can fly through them. And I'm sure if I could see all of you right now and I said, who has ever heard or seen a bird fly into a window, I think everybody would nod their heads that they have had that experience. So you know that birds fly into windows because they just don't see them. Now, when we have some large skyscrapers, and it doesn't matter if we're talking about Baltimore or Detroit or New York City, this is all over the country, all over the world. Flying into buildings is the leading cause of songbird mortality around the world. It is impressively huge how many songbirds die. So this picture represents, many of these pictures will represent a building and the birds that were collected that died by hitting the building during that migration. So some high rise in some large urban center like New York City might have volunteers that go and collect the birds, and then they store them in a freezer all season, and they'll do a photo op like this to try and convince folks to do things like turn off the lights in the office buildings before they go home for the night, as well as to convince the building owners themselves to perhaps engage in some ways to mitigate this many bird deaths. And I'll come back to that at the end. So I had seen these kinds of pictures. I knew that there was a lot of efforts to try and reduce bird strikes on buildings around the world. And I started wondering, are birds more likely to have this happen on an urban landscape or on a rural landscape? And my thoughts were that on a rural landscape, there's fewer buildings, right? There's Paul Smith sitting there. There's fewer buildings to run into. But on the other hand, are the birds less used to the buildings because they're used to this wild matrix of habitat around them? And so are they less adapted at avoiding the buildings? Are they more likely to hit perhaps? Is there more vegetation around the buildings so they're more likely to hit? What's going on there? So I worked with a group of students that I have listed also on this slide. And again, you'll hear how fantastic they are as I go through this part of the presentation. So here's Paul Smith, right? The picture on the left, the aerial photograph there, looking down, you see the red dots and where Paul Smith is, right? And then you see a close up to the right there. And the red buildings are the buildings that we identified as the buildings that were going to be part of our study. And so I'm guessing some of you alumni remember some of these buildings and know exactly where they are. And you probably have a good image of what those buildings are. So I'm not putting up images of all the buildings because I think some of you know these buildings already. So the students searched these buildings during fall migration. We searched for 2 fall migrations and we searched for 1 spring migration season. And the idea is that most of these birds are migrating at night and hitting the buildings at night, and to search the buildings as soon as we could after dawn. The literature has shown that in many places where birds hit buildings and fall to the ground, they get scavenged by even 8 or 9 o'clock in the morning. And I've seen red foxes on campus. There's other things that might come and scavenge, other critters that might scavenge those dead birds. So we wanted to be out there at the crack of dawn searching. So again, I've got great Smitties here. They're setting their alarm, getting up and searching underneath these buildings. And that also leads to why we searched what buildings we did. We didn't really want to search underneath dorm rooms at 5 o'clock in the morning. We thought that would be not appropriate. So that also led to not searching all the buildings. So we did that. We went out and searched all the buildings and collected bird carcasses so that we could try and answer this question. Okay, so yes, birds do hit the buildings on Paul Smith's campus. This was not shocking to us. We had many reports of birds hitting the buildings prior to beginning this, and that's probably what also catalyzed the study. There were several times where I was teaching class and somebody would come into my classroom and say, and held in their hands, a bird, say, this bird just hit a window. And a lot of times birds get stunned, they don't die. And so if you put them in a dark box and just let them have a chance to recover and then take the box outside and open it up, a lot of times they'll fly away just fine. So I knew birds were hitting buildings, and I was particularly worried about the library because there's lots of glass on that. And so that was one, this bird here actually did hit the library. This is where this one came from. So fortunately, we didn't find that many carcasses. That's a really good thing, right? Here are the species that we did find where we were able to identify them. Interestingly, the unknown ones were because oftentimes the carcass was already so disintegrated that we couldn't identify it. It doesn't seem very hard to find a bird carcass, but I think sometimes they do get missed. I'm pretty sure of it. If there's enough vegetation, maybe they fall into a bush and they're way above the searcher's head or something, maybe they fall out of the bush the next day. So sometimes we found basically, pile of feathers and not much else. So here's the species that we found. Not very many is one of the takeaway messages. The other thing to think about is what species that we were finding, and was that unusual at all? We went to the literature for that. These are the top 20 species colliding in Manhattan for the period of time there for about 20 years. And so what I've done is boxed around some of the species that we found. And so the species that we found are the species that tend to hit buildings. The one that's on here, juncos, that we didn't really find were rare juncos, right? So juncos are on this list, but we didn't really find juncos, even though we have lots of juncos around campus. But those juncos are here year round. So maybe they know where the buildings are, and so they're better at avoiding them. Okay, so the question that we had too was maybe we're still missing carcasses, especially when we're finding a carcass every now and then that's really decayed. And so we're thinking, okay, what are we missing? So we started a second phase to the study, and that was to figure out how long carcasses last in the Adirondacks, how long they persist. So we set out carcasses of birds in a variety of locations, not on campus. We didn't want to train any scavengers to come to campus. We didn't want to influence campus. We did them all off campus. So for instance, I had one at my neighbor's house, and the students found other places off campus to go put these with people's permission. And we put a trail camera in front of the carcass. And then we monitored the carcass via the trail camera to see what happened. And so this is a picture of a skunk coming in and scavenging one of the carcasses that we had put out. But really, we had very little scavenging of our carcasses. The line across the top is the first spring. The blue line is the winter part of the study, and then the orange one is in fall. And so we put out, you can see how many carcasses, ranging from 5 to 29 carcasses. Generally, the carcasses stuck around, and certainly for more than 24 hours for the most part. A little bit of scavenging, but not much. And so we were feeling like overall, most of our carcasses probably stuck around and we probably found most of the carcasses. So that's, again, a really good thing in terms of there aren't more birds dying that we weren't aware of. We're not missing any appreciable amount. Perhaps 10% of the birds got scavenged. We felt like that was a pretty, the best estimate that we could do. So I don't want to show you a lot of numbers, but I do want to break down how we got to this because numbers add up. These are the pennies that add up, if you will. So we found 11 carcasses in fall and then 9 the following fall. And so that would be an average of 10 carcasses for fall, if those 2 years are representative, right? And 7 carcasses were found during spring. So if we add those together, we could say on average, 17 carcasses during the annual migration months. Remember, we only search during migration in fall and spring. So it excludes the other months, but these are probably when more birds hit windows, probably. 10% could possibly not have been detected. You know, that would bump us from 17 to almost 19. And I see it flash sometimes up there, Heather. So if somebody has a question, feel free to jump in. So it might be as many as 19, but still a relatively low number, it seems, perhaps so far. Now, remember, we only searched about a third of the buildings. And so we were calculating this. It gets very complicated to calculate what a building's worth because they're different sizes and some have more windows, et cetera. But saying we basically searched, 34% about of the area that they could hit. That then extrapolates about 55 birds dying from striking all the buildings on our campus during just spring and fall. So about 55 birds per year dying just during spring and fall. So I don't know what your reaction is to that. But you can't help but think, oh, I didn't realize there was that many birds dying here every year. That was our reaction to that. And so we wanted to take that a little farther and say, well, what about the Adirondacks? So the students looked at census data and other kinds of data to do a rough estimate of how many buildings are in the Adirondacks. And then from that, extrapolate a very conservative estimate of how many songbirds die annually during migration due to hitting buildings. And so conservatively, they came up with at least 100,000 songbirds die annually during migration in the Adirondacks. Again, I'm not sure, I can't see your faces. It's really hard for me to not be able to see you, but I'm wondering what your reactions are because here it is, the Adirondacks, right? There's wilderness, there's forever wild. This is a place where animals are supposed to be free of human influence, right? And yet it appears that the Adirondacks are not an entirely safe haven for birds coming through. That really struck us. We still wanted to put this a bit in perspective. I'm sorry, I'm getting a little bit numbery here on here, but it still is hard for us to really wrap our heads around what was going on. So we decided to look at a bunch of different studies and calculate the number of carcasses that hit each building per day. And so there's several studies listed there. And at the bottom, you'll see Paul Smith's, with a typo in it, and are adjusted for the detectability rates. So the students calculated this, and I can't really think in terms of 0.08 carcasses per building per day. So we decided to basically standardize it. How many, at that rate, how many birds hit 10 buildings for 60 days, approximately migration? And so we did that. That gives us a standardized model that we kind of wrap our heads around. So again, you look at it, it seems like Paul Smith is fairly low compared to other studies, which I think I would expect. Our buildings aren't very big. At the most, just a few stories. We don't have very large buildings. So probably not surprising that we're on the low end here. But certainly I would say in line with what would be expected in a more urban area as well as other rural areas. So they're not particularly any safer on Paul Smith's campus. And these other rural areas are not like Adirondacks. It's, farm country sorts of rural with more development than we had. Okay, so there's the Paul Smith data at the bottom. Okay, so this did, of course, lead us really to a call for action. And so we started thinking about what can we do to try and make the Adirondacks safer. And so we started something called Bird Safe Adirondacks. And the students gathered different materials that are advertised to help protect birds. And we did some research on literature reviews of what they probably actually provide in terms of safety. And so there's a variety of products out there, lots of them. I could talk actually a whole 45 minutes just on how to protect houses and buildings from bird strikes. But what you see up here, you see some glass that's not completely see-through by having little dots on the glass. And I bet most of you have seen where they sell silhouettes of like a hawk or something that you put on your window to try and make the window more visible so that they're less likely to run into it. So there's a whole bunch of products out there. We put together several displays. So we had glass panes with these different products on them. And the students went to the Vic, they went to the public library, and also we went to a farmer's market to educate folks about what are some ways to try and protect their buildings. And so really anything you can do that makes your window more visible is helpful. And like I said, a huge range. We saw pictures of people that let their kids finger paint on the sliding glass doors during migration season so that birds don't hit their sliding glass doors. Really be creative. You can do anything. You can spend a whole lot of money, or you can spend a lot less money and still make it work. The other thing to think about for everybody, because I'm guessing some of you have bird feeders, if you put the bird feeder at a distance where when a bird gets frightened and flushes from it and it gets up a good amount of speed, it's more likely to die when it hits your house, right? And so we see there on that graphic, it's kind of giving you an idea of where the safest zone is for your bird feeder. If your bird feeder is closer to your house, they can't get as much speed to hit the window as fast, and they're less likely to be killed hitting a window. So actually moving your bird feeders closer to the house within 5 yards is safer for birds. So that's one thing you can do, or move them much farther than 10 yards away. So they're not going to probably just get flushed off and go right into the window. Okay, so that's a bit on the Bird Safe Adirondacks, the kind of the final wrap up of that project for that group of students. Again, lots of people to thank on this. The Cullman Foundation, who provided some funding for us through the Northern New York Audubon. Paul Smith has a faculty research and development grant. STEM is a scholarship program from NSF. They funded these students and they funded them in terms of scholarship money. And this is something I'm incredibly grateful for. Each of the STEM students listed there were selected through a rigorous selection process, and then they received scholarship money from NSF to offset tuition costs at Paul Smith College by participating in these projects. They would have done it for free, but it was nice to see their scholarship money be awarded to them also. So that's part 2 of my presentation. Any
Jorie,
questions
I just
on
have
that?
a couple of
Yes.
comments. Jim in Washington said that he believes the bird strikes depend on the window. Oh, and I missed some questions in chat, so we've got more. He says, my mother-in-law had a house in a canyon 15 miles from town of 800, and the windows were so inviting that as they were large picture windows. They had an aviary for watching them, and we had many dead hummingbirds every year, many others as well, and even a small hawk. It depends on the window and attraction to the house. Our mountain bluebirds would come to the windows and put their beaks to the windows and then try to fly in by fluttering over and over. He also said that he cut their bird strikes down 2/3 with the decal stickers.
Great.
And then I do have a couple of bird questions, it looks like.
Okay.
What is the expected total population of birds in the Adirondacks?
Ooh, I don't know. There's so many questions out there I don't know answers to. I don't know. I'm sure we could come up with some sort of estimate, but I don't think I've ever heard a number for that. Sorry, I can't answer that. And thanks also for the comments on reducing bird strikes. That's really cool that you were able to reduce that.
Doug Brush writes, how does that compare to cats? Audubon says cats kill a few billion songbirds per year. So how many would be killed in the Adirondacks?
By cats, I don't know how many are killed by cats in the Adirondacks, but yeah, cats and bird strikes are the 2 biggest without a doubt. And the bird strikes on buildings actually outkills the cats as worse mortality than the cats. Yeah, and then, big numbers. As far as an estimate, I guess to try and answer that, it's tough. There was some work done early trying to do some estimates, and it's so hard to estimate this. But they're saying, upwards of around 1 billion birds per year around the world, if I remember correctly. I should double check that. But yeah, big numbers. And it's not just songbirds. It's ducks, it's woodcock, it's egrets. I mean, lots of other species. We just see a lot of songbirds more than anything else.
Sure. Have you ever tried sound waves to get the birds to avoid buildings?
I have not, and I'm not familiar with any work on that. kind of related to that, some folks sell products that are supposed to be in the UV range. Birds can see in the UV range and we cannot. So the idea is if you paint your window with this UV, one looks sort of like a deodorant almost, just kind of roll it on. And so it was hard to find good data on how well those products work. One concern is some of those might wash off. Some of them may not actually be in the UV range, even if they're marketed that way. So it seems like something that we can see is probably a little better just because we're more sure of it. But of course, that blocks our view more, so we might be less likely to put it on. So anything you can do, I would say, is helpful. But yeah.
And do you have any information on the impact of wind turbines?
Oh, there's a whole nother thing. So I've been talking about building strikes, but really we could talk about any human created thing that contributes to bird deaths, and strikes are a big one, right? With wind turbines. So there's been a lot of work trying to figure out how do we minimize impacts with wind turbines, not just by songbirds, but also by bats. Bats appear to be attracted to the turbines, and so they're actually very likely to get hit. And so there's some really good work being done on how do we reduce impacts on bats. I know they've done some work on birds too. Again, I'm sorry, I don't know any numbers off the top of my head on that. I know I've seen them. There are a lot of numbers out there. Yeah. Yep.
Okay. More work to do for your students, huh?
Absolutely. Yeah. All right. And you know, the other piece of this too is we would like to retrofit a bunch of windows on campus, right? So this is where this is going. We do have the sustainability grant on campus that was created by Paul Smith students. They all basically volunteered to have this extra tuition fee that goes into a fund. And then we can, as faculty and students, appeal to the fund, get some money to do something towards sustainability. And so Kate, Glenn, and I have talked about putting together a grant through the sustainability fund to retrofit some buildings. So we would like very much to be reporting in a while that Freer and the library and some of the other buildings are not having the strikes that they used to have. So stay tuned for that piece of the story too.
Absolutely. I do have a question. Does it have to be the
Yes.
silhouette of a bird, or could we put a silhouette of, say, a leaning pine or a bobcat in all the
You
windows?
could. Oh, that's a great idea. I love it. Yes. The idea is basically you're just drawing their attention visually to the windows. So it can be anything. And again, I could keep talking about this, but if you just put one or two silhouettes on a big picture window, the birds are going to see the two silhouettes and then fly between them. Remember, songbirds fly between branches of trees very easily. And so they really only need a little space to fly between. So to really be effective with the silhouettes, you actually need to put quite a few and not have very many spaces. So there's some really neat things with these strings that you can just hang down that don't attract our attention, but they're really close together and the birds won't try and fly through them. So if you want to go even better than the silhouettes, having these strings hanging in front or even a screen on a window can make a big difference.
Sure.
Yep.
Absolutely. Great.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right. So I'm going to move on to part 3 of the story, surviving the Adirondacks, flying squirrels, and other small mammals. So it starts always with the simple questions, right? What species of small mammals live here? This was my question when I arrived in the Adirondacks, so 16 years ago. And so I thought, okay, that's an easy question to answer, right? I just go out there and I look and all the work's been done, right? So taking, for instance, bog lemmings, southern bog lemmings, you look at this and you say, oh, okay, so southern bog lemmings are, definitely here. And then you look at the northern bog lemming and you think, they're not here. That's kind of end of that story, right? And then you go to your next source and you go, oh, this author's telling me that northern and southern bog lemmings are here in the Adirondacks. And I think you all recognize the outline of the Adirondack Parks. Those are townships within the park. So they've been noted wherever a township had bog lemmings in them. And so, I start to wonder, okay, how the one map says they're here and another map says they're not. And there's some really phenomenal sources. So Miriam is one of the founders of the American Society of Mammalogists. He did some wonderful mammalogy research, and he actually came to the Adirondacks. So there is some historical literature that I can go to and have been looking at to try and understand, like, what's here now, what was here that isn't here now, and trying to piece this all together. There's also some phenomenal data sets. So this VertNet is actually a database of mammals, a lot more than mammals, but specimens in museums. And so I can go into VertNet and I can look for the southern bog lemming and I can see who has collected it when. And where they actually found it. So this is just a little snapshot of some of the specimens that were collected here in the past. So I feel like I can start to put together the story. And I found no mention of northern bog lemmings in VertNet whatsoever. And there's some other sources I can check also, but we're really in the beginning stages of trying to understand what's actually here now and what was here historically, in case there's a difference, which there sure could be. Another one that I'm really fascinated by is this rock vole, also known as the yellow-nosed vole. So again, we see a map there from one source, and looking at the rock voles, looks like, yeah, they extend down through the Adirondacks. They're here. And I look back at my other same source and I say, oh yeah, in fact, it looks like there's probably some records here of where the rock voles are. I go to VertNet and I look, and the records I'm finding are basically on Mount Marcy and Whiteface Mountain. Did anybody even search anywhere else? How much was searched? We have a lot of questions. If these are the only records on basically Mount Marcy and Whiteface, do we have no idea where else they might actually be in the Adirondacks? They like rocky slopes. They like the rocky talus. So they are most likely to be constrained to those kinds of areas. But we don't have a good sense of what was here and is it still here? Okay, so this is some work I'm just starting, and it's going to start with some field studies. And so some students have already been working with me in terms of starting to set up, like, how do we go about determining what species are here? And trying to get into too much detail. So we will be collecting live specimens and seeing if we can identify them 100% in the field. If we have something that's fairly difficult to differentiate, like southern versus northern bog lemmings, we plan on grabbing just a little bit of tissue, basically like an ear punch when you get an ear pierce, just a little bit of skin tissue, and then we'll use molecular methods to determine if it's northern or southern bog lemming. That's the plan. So this is in the very early stages. So stay tuned to hear more about that in the future as we get going on that. And so the next question that you might probably guess is, I'm wondering, how is their persistence affected here in the short term? What's happening to small mammals in the short term here in the Adirondacks? And I bring this up because a student came to me and was asking about flying squirrels. This was, I'm trying to remember, probably my second year at Paul Smith's. And so the question was, can they fly? Can they glide? Can they glide across Route 3, that runs right past campus? And according to the literature, they sure can. It should be fairly easy for them to glide across that road. They'll lose some height as they go across, but they certainly can make it across. It's not too big of a gap for them to do that. So the student asked, he said, well, can we go out there and actually see if they are crossing Route 30 outside the school? So the map inset right there, of course, is Paul Smith's. Where the red star is approximately where his study site was. The diagram here is showing you the road that goes right through there. And what you see on each side, the numbers are the numbers of the traps. So the campus side of the road, the opposite side, they have the same number of traps on either side. That's not particularly important, but they have a bunch of traps on either side. The traps are 10 meters apart from each other, right? And Route 30 is 21 meters wide. This is Eric Holt's work. I didn't mention him yet by name. So this is Eric Holt's curiosity, who said, let's see if they're actually crossing this road. So he set out the traps, and then he checked the traps repeatedly and monitored where the squirrels were, looking to see if they were indeed crossing the road or not. These simple questions that, I thought, oh, of course they're crossing the road. We'll find that. Let me show you his data here. So this is Eric's data showing you the distance traveled between recaptures. So when he caught a squirrel at one trap and then recaught it, how many meters away was it? It shows a really nice spread of how far they were traveling, up to 140 meters away from where he first caught them. Now the road's only 21 meters wide, so that's marked on the figure. So certainly they're capable of traveling much farther than 21 meters. They did that, right? We can see they traveled up to 140 meters. But when he did his work, he didn't have a single squirrel from either side of the road ever be found on the opposite side of the road. Again, like much of our work, it's fairly limited in scope. We didn't do it for, season after season, but he was able to say that we have no evidence, at least, of squirrels crossing that road. Again, I find this really shocking because we know a lot about genetics and inbreeding and what happens to small populations on islands. If there's no new genetic material coming in, oftentimes a population cannot persist because it doesn't have the genetic diversity to persist. We don't have that many roads in the Adirondacks, but if they're not able to actually cross the roads, or at least not cross them frequently, it appears this road is actually a barrier. Even if they can cross it and they are crossing it, it is still functioning as a barrier. So how does that affect the genetics? We haven't even remotely taken on that question. I'm not a geneticist, but I think it's an interesting question waiting to be asked. And we have found out since then, there has been other work just like this down in the Smoky Mountains. with the Blue Ridge Parkway, that the Blue Ridge Parkway is bisecting the habitat of flying squirrels, and they are not crossing the road there either. So this is not limited to the Adirondacks. So this is one reason why we're asking about, short-term persistence. If some of these small mammal populations are basically islands separated by a road, how long can they persist for? Okay. And of course, we're also interested in things like long-term. Okay, if we used to have northern bog lemmings here and we don't anymore, right? We want to know these things. And so the questions that I'll be asking them on sabbatical this upcoming year, and so this is where we're really going to dive into these small mammal questions, and start to think about where are they, let's document where they are, but let's also think about how they might persist into the future or not. And of course, many of you, I'm sure, have seen maps like this, predicting via climate change how our forests might change over time. And as the forests change, how might that actually change what small mammal populations live in our forests? So short-term and long-term. And I'm wrapping this one up, so you have a heads up on that. To keep every cog and wheel is the first precaution of intelligent tinkering. I think many of you probably know that quote from Aldo Leopold. And that's what really strikes me as I'm thinking about this upcoming work with small mammal diversity in the Adirondacks. If we don't even know what's here, how can we work towards protecting it and making sure that it continues to fill its role in the ecosystem? All right, really a huge heartfelt thanks to all the Paulson students and faculty that have shared in the work over the years, and the camaraderie. It's been absolutely wonderful. I was hoping some of them would be on this potentially. If anybody is here that I've worked with over the years, please make sure you pipe up and tell us. But open to any questions that anybody has at this point.
I did have one question come in from Ron Perlick.
Mm-hmm.
Curious that there are no rock voles in Pennsylvania, considering they are in the Adirondacks and Southern Appalachians, or Appalachian, however you say it.
Right. And I wish I could comment more knowledgeably about what exactly is going on there. I'm wondering quite a bit about how much do we search for things, how much effort was put into finding different species in different places over time. There might be some specimens somewhere that just haven't been in the VertiNet database, for example. I have a lot of questions about just how do we know what's here before I even get more into the work.
I'm waiting for more questions, but as I'm looking, someone logged in as Tree, and I have a feeling that's Teresa Troy.
I bet I know Tree. Hi, Tree. Teresa Troy, I'm guessing.
I'm guessing because I don't know many people that go by the name Tree, and I don't even think she goes by Troy anymore.
Oh, okay. I could be behind.
Well, I think I may have attended an event last summer. Or was it in the fall? I did a few events last summer at Tucker Farms, and she may have another name.
Fantastic.
Let's see. Pam Nobles has joined us. I'm sorry I didn't see your name earlier. Karen Frank and Peter Frank. Oh, I've got a question. Have you observed peregrine falcons nesting in the Adirondacks yet?
I have not personally. No, I have not. And there are folks who are definitely keeping track. New York DEC does a good job of that. Once upon a time, I was a wildlife technician. It was actually last century, literally, for DEC. And my job was to monitor the peregrines from basically New Paltz down to Bear Mountain Bridge. And I also had opportunity to go out on some of the other places, Verrazano Narrows and whatnot, those bridges in New York City, and see peregrines out there. So I know they do a good job of keeping track of peregrines where they're nesting, and asking folks to stay away from the climbing routes when the peregrines are nesting there.
Okay. Peter Whitchurch says he worked the New York State Small Mammal Study at Huntington Forest, Long Lake Township, summer of '66.
Yay!
No,
some of the best data we have, right? Absolutely. I did a huge shout out. So ESF has kept long-term monitoring sorts of things, looking at small mammal tracks and small mammal populations over the years. Really great work. It's phenomenal. Yes.
He said,
I didn't mean to interrupt. Was there another follow-up to
that? He just said that there were no rock voles or lemmings that year. So,
yep.
Add that to your notes.
Yes.
And it is in fact Teresa Troy. Of course it is. So back in the snowshoe hare slides, you don't have to go back to them. I just want to say Katie DeGrave, is it DeGrave? DeGraves?
Caitlin DeGrave?
Caitlin, there we go.
Yes.
She was in Alaska when I was there last summer, and I got to visit her. I can't remember the name of the center. It was similar to a wild center.
Alaska Sea Life, right?
That's
so
it.
Caitlin's
And I
in
went there and met her there. She was one of the only Smitties I saw when I was there. It was a personal trip. It wasn't a work trip, but I couldn't not go see her. And she's now in North Carolina, so I'm really excited. I'm hoping to see her again. She was working with penguins in Alaska, which was really cool. And she was totally into it. You could tell she's definitely more of a penguin person than a person. She loves her.
She's a good person too. Yes,
she is. She definitely is.
I know the wildlife degree is new since some of our alumni went to Paul Smith's, and if you aren't aware, alums, our fish and wildlife alumni really go all over, and they'll set something like, I want to work with owls, I don't care where, and then off they go to Arizona or Southern California and work with owls. Or they say, I really want to work in Alaska, I don't care what species I work with, I just want to go to Alaska, and then off they go.
Right, and she
really
did.
It's amazing where our students are. Just to give you some idea too, I mean, our students head off to graduate school also. I hope it's okay to say some names, I guess it's all public knowledge. We have a student who graduated who's now working on her PhD in Maine on moose disease ecology. We have a student who's working on a graduate degree down in Brownsville, Texas, looking at small cats and carnivores crossing the roads down there, and they're using trail cameras to look at things like ocelot mortalities by cars. Our students are all over the place. I'm sure alum realize this because you run into them everywhere, but I'm still just so in awe of our students and all the cool things they do.
Sure. We've got Cassandra McEwen is out in
she just went out west.
Yes, the Grand Canyon. She's doing bird stuff out there, and don't ask me specifics because I don't know. I just know she was super excited and started talking in Latin, and I don't know. She was so happy. Let's see. I've got a couple more comments. A comment. The questions that students come up with always amazes me. My own students and yours as well. Yes. Whoever made that comment, I assume you're a teacher somewhere. I'm curious. Are you a science teacher? What do you teach? David, if I say your name wrong, I'm sorry. Is it? I don't think it's Spoonable, but
David Spawnable. We know him.
There we go. Sure. I have to hear it once.
Yeah, he's a well-known educator in Beekmantown.
Excellent. Oh, Beekmantown. Fantastic. Yes. No, isn't it fantastic? I will teach the same class I have for like 15 years. Every year in natural history, students ask me questions that nobody else has ever asked me, and I have no idea what the answer is. And I say, well, let's go find out. And we've looked up all kinds of cool things about giraffes and everything else over the years. I mean, it is, I just feel like students' minds are just the right primed place to just think off in any direction and come up with such cool questions. And he teaches earth science. Okay. He answered back and he said, they don't allow rock climbing at Poco Moonshine during peregrine breeding season. Right. Very cool. And honestly, a shout out to the rock climbers. I understand overall as a group, they're pretty good. I mean, they want to abide by these regulations. I'm sure it's tempting, but I understand that most rock climbers are pretty good at obeying those regulations. Absolutely. Yep. Do we have more questions for Jorie this evening? They're kind of quiet. You covered a lot. They're probably all putting decals on their windows right now. I hope so.
Jorie, you mentioned you're going to go on sabbatical. What will you be? What's your project? What are you going to be
So
studying?
it is looking at small mammal diversity of the Adirondacks, and I'll stick mostly, around campus northern Adirondacks, just for logistic reasons. But what I'm getting so far from looking at the literature and the big data sets, the databases, I don't think we have a good sense of what was here, much less what is here now. And so it's gonna be hard to move into the future without documenting some of that. So we're really hoping to document. It's hard to document some things not here. So hopefully we'll be able to document some things are here. I say some things, some small mammals. No. A question. And actually, northern and flying squirrels. Can I just jump in real quick? northern and flying squirrels, right? We can tell the difference when you have them in the hand. You can look at their belly hairs and figure out which they are. I don't think we really have a good sense for sure which ones are where in the Adirondacks, and I'm pretty sure that's going to change over time. We're going to see more southern and less northern, but unless we document that now, we won't be able to say that it actually changed. And it'll change because climate change, right? So that's, I think, a really important question too.
So what is your favorite Adirondack critter, Jorie?
I don't have favorites. It's like asking a mom who their favorite is. I really don't. A lot of times I just tell students I'm really motivated by the questions, and then it's whatever species helps me answer those questions. I'm mostly a mammal person. I'm mostly a bird person. I don't know as much about herps or fish. But what I'm really interested in is animal behavior. And I'm interested specifically in why they move about their home range like they do. So not migrations, not dispersal movements, but in their home range, when they get up in the morning, why do they go walk up that ridge versus go that way? And so that's what I've looked into mostly. And that's how I ended up starting off with snowshoe hares. I thought they're going to be easy to figure out, and they're relatively easy compared to more complex species, but yeah.
Is the bald eagle frequently sighted in the Adirondacks?
Ooh, I would say there's more sightings now, obviously, than there were decades ago, for sure. And, you know, we even worry a bit about them feeding on, say, deer carcasses on the side of the road in winter. So DOT picks up deer carcasses so bald eagles don't get hit. So such a, I hope this isn't too down, all the survivorship mortalities, that's what I'm thinking about. But the other thing, of course, is lead poisoning. Lead poisoning is still an issue for bald eagles. DDT was the issue, you know, back in the 60s and 70s. But more recently, the issue has been lead poisoning. So as you know, lead builds up in prey species, then it magnifies, it builds up, and so it gets eaten by the bald eagles when they forage on and they scavenge on those species. So we do still see lead poisoning. There's still work to be done there. Oh, and I could talk about lead-free and all that stuff, but I won't do that today. Maybe I should anyways. All of you that love animals, try not to use lead where you don't need to. I'm thinking like hunting and fishing. Don't forget, we took lead out of gasoline. We don't allow, you know, paint on the walls that has lead in it to be eaten by small children. You all know this from when you buy a house. And so if you can hunt or fish lead-free or reduce the amount of lead you leave in the environment, it makes a real impact on everything from bald eagles down to shrews. I worked on a study years ago where we were collecting shrews and looking at lead levels in shrews. They're eating the earthworms that are in the soil where the lead was, right? And so this is a problem.
Wow.
Yeah. More than you wanted to know. Okay, I'll stop.
No, it's all about the circle. It's all about the circle of life, right?
Yep.
I can say I've seen eagles just across from my house, and last year it was amazing. I was at a Boy Scout meeting at the Fish and Game Club, and they were outside doing, I don't know what they were doing, practicing building fires or something. And I look over and I see an eagle flying over the river, and then I see 3 more. They were playing. It was the most amazing thing. And I'm like, stop what you're doing. Look where you are. Look what and they're like, that's cool. And they went back to what they were doing. I'm like, you don't understand. 30 years ago, you wouldn't have seen this.
Right.
It's just,
right.
it's amazing.
Take it for granted, right?
Right. There's a nesting pair on Osceola Lake and Saranac Lake. Well, I can't find the nest near my house, but I know there's one close by. Way more now than in the 60s and 70s. I almost never saw eagles when I was there in my teens and 20s. I can usually go somewhere and see one or more kayaking on a regular basis. Yep.
There's the good news story, maybe to end the day on, is that there are more bald eagles, not just in the Adirondacks, but New York and the United States. They have done a wonderful recovery. It's been a great success story. Yes.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, Jorie, I think our questions have run out. DDT took 40 years to make a difference. Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
Takes a long time. When you only have 1 or possibly 2 chicks or so at a time, it takes a long time to recover.
Sure. Okay.
Jorie, this was fantastic. I mean, that was so fun and educational. So thank you very much.
You're welcome very much. Thank you, everybody, for coming. When I run into you somewhere else, be sure you say hi in person so I can see you.
And this will be available on our YouTube channel and on the college's website. So tell a friend, say, hey, go check out that great presentation Jorie did. It'll be available for review.
Absolutely.
Okay.
as are all of our Smitty story hours. We record them and then post them to our website and YouTube channel. Takes a day or so. I'm not very IT savvy. So I have people to do it for me and they're busy. So give us a couple of days and this presentation will be up there as well. And Jorie, can you just tell us where we can follow you online, because your natural science social
Yes.
media is very
So-
active.
Oh, that's a good point. At the bottom of the slide, see where it says at PSC Nat Sci. That should help quite a bit. I am not a social media person either. I should be more into it, I suppose. But we have a Facebook page. So if you look for Paul Smith College Natural Science, you'll definitely find us. We have an Instagram. We're just starting the Twitter thing. And we have a YouTube channel also. I'm trying to think
And a
the best
whole
way to
series
get
of
that.
brand new videos coming out.
Oh, we do.
Stay
Yes.
tuned. I've seen them.
Yes.
They're fantastic.
We're hoping Beekman Town to have some videos that high school teachers can use. The idea is that we do enough of this thing, like, how do you identify these trees? How do you spell mammal trap? That we can put up a series of videos. We're starting to build those up, a little library for high school teachers to use. Yep.
That's
If
awesome.
anybody else would like access to any specific videos, let us know too, and we'll see what we can do.
That's great. Well, thank you everyone for joining us this evening. We'll see you in a couple weeks for the next Smitty Story Hour, where we will be featuring Joe Conto, class of '85, and Jamie Burdowski, class of 2005. I like having alums come back and share some knowledge with us. Should be a fun time. And thanks again, everybody.
Thank you. Bye.
Have a
Thanks,
good night.
Jorie.
Good night.
This was a fun one, Steve. We still have a couple of folks on with us.
It was fun. I was sitting on the edge of my chair. Jorie gets a little excited and she's quite passionate about her topic. So
Absolutely, absolutely. For a couple of years, she would do a radio tracking class during reunion for us. And she would hide some of the monitors somewhere and take people out and teach them how to track. And it was really cool. One year she couldn't do it. And I had an alum, Ben Tabor, he works for DC, and he came and did it for me one year. He actually, in his career, was tracking moose in the
That's
Adirondacks. And it's just amazing. He goes up in these little planes and has a pilot and flying around tracking a moose. And I'm like, this is crazy. But I love that they do it and that they are so willing to share with others.
the Smitty spirit.
It is. When she said, they were getting up at all hours to go look for, birds and what, I'm not surprised. Not
Yeah,
at all.
I'm glad they avoided the res halls. That would be a little
Yeah, that's a
compromise.
tough one. That's a tough one. But all right. Well, boss, I think I'm going to go home because you expect me back here in 12 hours.
Yes. Bright-eyed and bushy-tailed.
Oh, I wouldn't go that far.
Have a good night.
All right.
Take
Thank
care.
Bye-bye.